Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Crysler. Each episode, we talk to business leaders and subject matter experts to learn about the challenges they've overcome and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. Nearly every manufacturer that I walk into has a similar set of challenges when it comes to maintaining or determining a source of truth for that particular business. Generally, they are running at least two systems and sources of truth that they have to maintain, which becomes very challenging to know where to get answers from. And depending on where you're at in the organization is what you tend to utilize as your, individual source of truth. So it's the lens by with which you see problems and solutions throughout the business. And, whenever I walk into these shops, I'm always looking for that same thing to be able to identify where these sources of truth live. And it's important to note, it doesn't mean that people are bad at their job because they've created some sort of, workaround or additional sort of source of truth. But it is a real challenge from the clarity, consistency, and accountability when you're trying to maintain multiple sources of truth. So the easiest way to spot this, and I would almost guarantee that as you walk around your organization, you'll be able to see some of these things. But, where's the workaround at, right? Where's the spreadsheet, the, second set of notes, the, in some cases, the other piece of technology that live where there's kind of these two, parallel universes, if you will. I was working with a print manufacturer that was really challenged from a variety of ways. But one of the things that we unpacked there was the fact that they have both an accounting system and a MIS system. Now, just on the surface, that's not really a huge problem, right? Assuming that the kind of sources of truth are in sync and remain in sync. But one of the big challenges with this particular company is the fact that those two sources of truth kind of lived independently from each other. And depending on what the scenario was, there could be a third source of truth. And I'll get into that in a second. But it was really dependent on what the scenario was in terms of like which source of truth won. So as you can imagine, the amount of time it took to execute a really simple process like invoicing for a particular order now all of a sudden became, what's correct? Do we follow what's inside of the MIS? Do we follow, here's the third source of truth, the paper traveler, right? Like the job jacket that went along with the job? Or do we follow the accounting system, right? Like the other source of truth or the other set of records. And so it became really challenging to understand, at what point in time do we follow each one? And what I've found over the course of time, when I see these examples time and time again across a variety of companies, both in the manufacturing space and outside of it, is that generally the source of truth is dependent on where that person is at, like in the org, right? So for example, in the company I was just speaking of, right? You've got an operations leader who wants to rely solely on the MIS, right? The management information system, the information that lives within there. And then you've got some of the folks that are throughout the org, right? Maybe closer to doing the work, or folks that maybe don't feel as much comfort in the fact that this information should live in the MIS. They're handwriting notes on the traveler or job ticket. So their perspective is, that is the source of truth, right? Yes, I get that we have something in the MIS, but that is not up to date, accurate. So we should go off of what is physically written on the job traveler. And then you've got the folks in accounting who are saying, what is correct between those two things? And how do I, align that with what we need from a pure accounting perspective to make sure that we've captured all of this, right? Now, this particular business, what makes it additionally challenging is the fact that on some orders, they are, collecting payments ahead of time. So a prepay or sometimes a deposit scenario. And then they have to match all of this up. So as you can imagine, what would it take to go through the kind of invoicing and reconciliation process when you've got now 3 different sources of truth, and dependent on that particular customer, order, day of the week, right? It could be one of those 3 versions that ultimately wins out, right? So again, this has nothing to do with, who's right and who's wrong, or, people being bad at their jobs, but has everything to do with that clarity, consistency, and accountability, and how we define, from an organizational perspective, how do we define what sources of truth maintain what, set of information, kind of end to end for our business, right? So one thing I want to, dive into here is the fact that, this stuff kind of doesn't happen by accident, right? People don't wake up one day and say, I'm going to introduce a new source of truth, right? It's like this stuff takes time to morph. And what's underneath all of it, right? What's the root cause of it is the fact that, nobody, and what I mean by nobody is, someone in leadership, right? And we could talk about the variety of levels that happens at, right? But it's like nobody in leadership kind of made the determination, and then again, through that clarity, consistency, and accountability, reinforced it, right? So I'm going to kind of maybe keep coming back to this example because it illustrates a lot of things. So, the example I just unpacked with this particular print manufacturing business, leadership could have certainly said, from a manufacturing perspective, our source of truth is going to be our MIS system. But what that would have required is clarity, consistency, and accountability that was the source of truth. Meaning when things happened physically and there was maybe a note or something that had to be relayed or a status update, that information went back and was maintained inside of the MIS. And that's what tends to happen and unfold over the course of time is that, from leadership, often there's this perception that, well, everybody knows. And what I find time and time again is that there's a big gap between, well, it's this today, it's that tomorrow. I wrote another article earlier today talking about this idea of like, if I make a decision, I'm wrong. If I wait, to talk to you, I'm wrong because it took too much time, right? So it's like there's never any winning. And what ends up happening with all of these workarounds, the whole reason they begin that, like they come to be in the first place, is because somebody had to make a decision and they were searching for an answer. And because there is not a lot of, communication or consistency around that, around understanding like what are the roadblocks, what's unclear, what are you struggling with from a responsibility and task execution perspective, people do what they do, like the best that they can given the things that they're given, right? So, that's not to say nobody ever does anything malicious. Of course, that's not true. But by and large, the vast majority of people are just trying to get by and do move the needle forward, kind of given whatever it is that they are given. And then what ends up happening internally is a lot of, kind of infighting, if you will, which reinforces this whole entire idea around, silos and, order entry, customer service versus manufacturing versus finance versus leadership. right? And what's underneath all of that is just this frustration around the clarity, consistency, and accountability. So if we do a better job of clearly defining, in this case, what's the source of truth? How are we supposed to be transacting these things? How do we maintain them, and that we're consistent in the reinforcement of that decision, right? Again, that's where we tend to backslide as a leadership group is, maybe I don't feel real comfortable utilizing this tool, so I do it a different way. Well, what kind of message is that sending, to the rest of the team if I, as the leader, am unwilling to kind of follow the same rules? And it's rules for thee, not for me, different scenario, right? So, this idea around like what number do we use, right, is probably one of the most expensive questions that gets asked throughout the organization. And it's because it causes chaos. It causes people to have to justify how they came up with that particular information. And just generally speaking, it slows everything down because instead of, in the example I gave, instead of, that order being shipped out, coming to the accounting team and them creating or finalizing the invoice and, reconciling whatever the payment's been, they're having to go backtrack and kind of retell the story, which means that everybody else that's touched that particular order, potentially needs to be consulted on what happened. And if we don't do that and we just kind of, pick a number, we could be putting ourselves at financial risk because we've not captured, the full kind of cadence or breadth of that particular order. So we could be missing out on miscellaneous charges, rush fees, those types of things because, maybe we haven't systematically captured that. Maybe that only lives on the, manual paper traveler and, accounting should just know that they should go and pull all of these job tickets and take a look at them, with a fine tooth comb. The problem is, and what I see time and time again, is that in the course of that unfolding, right, in a day-to-day environment, you've got both sides of the fence that you try to play from a leadership perspective. Because on one hand, it's, why isn't, this stuff getting invoiced fast enough? We're so delayed. It takes us so long to get through invoicing, but we're not digging down and unpacking like, well, what are we having to do to be able to, do the invoice process? Right. So again, we go at it from both sides of the fence, or it's like, hey, we need to streamline this, but we're also not willing to do, the clarity, consistency, and accountability on this other part of it that's actually triggering, all of these different, events from unfolding. Right. So again, I go back to this idea that, depending on where exactly you're at in the org and what kind of exposure you have, right? What kind of angst is happening in this organization? You're going to come at it and try to justify what is happening based on what right? And it's another kind of dangerous thing from a pure leadership perspective. Like I learned, I probably learned this lesson the hard way and years ago when I kind of had my first, real serious leadership role. It's really easy when you kind of don't have all of the information to think that there's a decision that should be made, that should be easy to make, because you don't have the full end-to-end, picture or spectrum of what, maybe somebody at a higher leadership level than you is dealing with. And so outside looking in, it may look really simple, really easy. And I learned this because, when I had that position, I would often, question or get frustrated by this decision versus that decision, or, the seemingly lack of consistency. And what I didn't learn until I ascended into a similar position is that there's lots of shades of gray, and there's very little that ends up being black and white. But that doesn't mean that we can't create clarity, that we can't communicate consistency, consistently and ultimately hold people accountable. It just means that we have to be much more intentional about it. And so the real lesson is that when we don't do that and we let these multiple sources of truth kind of run wild throughout our organization, um, because those folks generally don't have that end to end picture, it's really difficult for them to make any other, kind of sustainable, lasting change, which is why it falls onto leadership shoulders to do that, right? So there's just, again, a ton of dynamics, at play with this. And another thing that I think is important to mention about this general idea of multiple sources of truth, because I can hear people asking like, well, Dave, what about, kind of financial source of truth or manufacturing source of truth? You've got, maybe prospect or customer source of truth, because you have a variety of systems, you have a variety of tools, throughout a traditional system architecture. And that's not really the problem. The problem is how they are synced, right? And so again, it's not necessarily straight out of the gate a problem that you have a CRM and ERP, a CRM and an MIS, a ERP and some processes that live outside of that within Excel and that are reporting tools. The problem is when these things are not in sync and there is no reconciliation between them, because then you don't know what information to rely on. Is our customer database inside of our ERP accurate, or is our customer database that lives inside of our CRM accurate? Is our financial planning and analysis that comes out of Excel accurate, or is the financial data that lives inside of our ERP or accounting tool accurate? Right. So that's the real gap. It's not necessarily, that we have multiple tools, because I've seen lots of organizations be really successful, having these multiple sources of truth in terms of, discrete, functions, right? But it's the alignment between them. It's the angst that people don't know what to rely on. Again, I go back to what I said earlier in terms of, which number, and that being the most expensive, kind of question throughout your org. Because if you're spending, time understanding if this report you just received is accurate because you don't trust where that information came from, like, that's a giant problem, right? Because now you set off this series of events where you're having to unpack, like, is this correct? What do I do with this information? How do I move forward? How do I action it? How do I prioritize it? Right? All of those different things. So again, it really circles back to the central idea of, this creating the clarity, consistency, and accountability, but from a leadership perspective, understanding, like, where do we want this information to live? How do we sync this up? How do we create that clarity, consistency, and accountability across the org? And, that takes a lot of work, right? It takes a lot of kind of time and strategic thinking to navigate that, especially if you're in an organization that has these multiple sources of truth, because, the first question is, where do we start, right? If we have an ERP or an MIS and we have an accounting tool and we have a CRM, but we have some offline, Excel worksheets that we utilize for a variety of reasons. It's like, what's that starting point? And, while dependent on your particular situation, I would weigh in a variety of ways. What I would say the best, course of action is to just kind of pick one. And if you have an ERP, that's probably a great source of record. But if you're not utilizing your ERP from an accounting perspective and you're utilizing it more to maybe manage inventory or manage products, right? I probably wouldn't lean towards that. I probably would lean more towards my accounting tool as being the source of truth. And then, then branch out from there, right? Do we have accuracy, let's say, in that same, system architecture that do we have that same accuracy from our accounting system of record to our, customer information? Maybe that is in our CRM, right? And then another layer specific to that, is our CRM really about maintaining customer relationships? Or is that really more a sales and marketing tool in terms of identifying prospects and the sales cycle from, early stage prospecting into converted, closed won customer, right? So again, there's a lot of different, dynamics or aspects, variables, if you will, kind of at play to make an ultimate determination. But if you're struggling with any of this stuff and you want to start to move in a direction, it really does come down to picking one. That's not to say, I had this conversation with the leader yesterday, but it's just because you pick one today doesn't mean that you can't change it, in the future. Now, should you change it every other day? No, absolutely not, right? Like, I think that's obvious. But, sometimes I think we get so into the analysis paralysis that we fail to make a decision to just move forward. And, you can change your mind given new input. That's not the scenario, right? We don't have to have that perfect plan. We can improve things through our cycle of improvement, right? Plan, do, check, act. Plan, execute, review, revise, repeat, right? So we can do all of those things. And kind of on a last closing note, right? I talked about this at the beginning, right? But this has nothing to do with, being a people problem. This is a system problem at its heart. And the only way through it is to go back and create that clarity, consistency, and accountability, regardless of the tools, right? This isn't a tool problem. It's not a people problem. There's definitely elements of those things, but it's zoomed out. It's a system problem. So we've got to define it through that lens of planning, people, process, technology, in order to be able to create that clarity, consistency, and accountability throughout your org. So as a reminder, each one of our solo episodes for the podcast, this is, kind of do a extension of our free weekly newsletter. But that one is a bit more, well thought out in terms of outline and kind of some tactical advice. I love the podcast because I get an opportunity to kind of tell some stories and think through each one of these, story arc of what I see in with my client work, lessons I've learned from my past. So would encourage you to go check out the free weekly newsletter. Free to subscribe, free to unsubscribe if you're not getting any value out of that, and also encourage you to tune into this podcast every week. We also post on the YouTube if you prefer to watch it as well. So thanks so much for joining, and I'll catch you on the next episode.
Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Crysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Crysler.